In this unit, we're going to look at the War of the Union, 1861 to 1865. Lincoln's inauguration. President Lincoln's strategy regarding secession focused on keeping the states of the Upper South in the Union. Lincoln firmly, in a conciliatory manner, assured the rights of the South would be protected, stating, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the state where it exists." But Lincoln would not allow secession, declaring that no state, upon its own mere action, can lawfully get out of the Union. The Union was perpetual, and as the President, he would execute the laws of the Union in all states and would hold, occupy, and possess any federal property in any state. Violence could be avoided unless it be forced upon the national authority. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not to mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government. Why, I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Through passion may have strained it, must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will, by the better angels of our nature. In one way, when you look at what Lincoln was saying, that the issue of civil war is in your hands, he's setting up the South and ready to pick a fight, but make it look like it's the South's fault, similar to what he accused Polk of doing, firing on Fort Sumter. Anderson offered to surrender when his supplies ran out in about 2 days, not knowing of the resupply attempt. South Carolina rejected it, knowing that the resupply ship was already en route. Edmund Ruffin, the fire eater and now a member of the South Carolina militia, was given the honor of firing on the fort. Shore batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, beginning the war. Civilians watched with fascination from the rooftops around Charleston Harbor. About 40 hours of intense but bloodless bombardment occurred. Anderson would then hoist the white flag of surrender on 13th of April. South Carolina demanded that Major Anderson surrender the fort at once. The Civil War had begun. A bloodless battle would begin the bloodiest war in American history. And so we see the eve of the nation on the brink of the Civil War. The Confederacy at this time, this is what was the borderline. Those are the states that seceded before Sumter. What we'll soon see in the next unit of study is 4 more states who had warned, don't try to bring the South back into the Union, will then secede from the Union, being Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. For Lincoln, the big event that he's going to have to try to solve is how to keep Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware with the Union. So this ends our unit of study of the tensions in the United States. Next, we'll look at the American Civil War, the War for Union. The First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, July 21st, 1861. The North and South had different names for many of the same battles. The North usually named them after geographical features, while the South named them after a nearby town. Brigadier General Irwin McDowell outlined a plan for attacking the Confederates in Virginia, but he did not want to fight. "This is not an army," he warned the president. It is true that you are green. They are green also. We are all green alike, said Lincoln. On July 16th, the volunteer army of 37,000 men marched into Virginia. Their aim? To cut off the railroad at Manassas, then move on at last to Richmond. General P.G.T. Beauregard. By July 30th, the Confederate Army was 35,000. Beauregard made his headquarters in Wilmer McLean's farmhouse. The Confederates formed an 8-mile meandering line along the side of Bull Run Creek, less than 25 miles from Washington. Hundreds of Washingtonians rode out in hoping to see a real battle. Field glasses, picnic baskets, and bottles of champagne. And on the morning of the 21st, McDowell sent his men across Bull Run. They smashed into the left side of the Confederate line. An onlooker said the advancing army looked like a bristling monster, lifting itself in a slow, wavering motion up the laborious ascent. Union victory seemed all but assured. Holding a hill in the center of the Southern line was the Virginia Brigade under the command of Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson. While other commands wavered, Jackson's held firm. Brigadier General Bernard E. Bee of South Carolina said, "Look, there's Jackson with the Virginians standing like a stone wall. Rally around the Virginians." The name Stonewall would stick. At 4 p.m., as the Union attack had faltered and Beauregard had received late Confederate reinforcements arriving by horseback and train from the valley, he ordered a counterattack. Jackson ordered his men to yell like furies. The rebel yell, first heard that day, would echo on 1,000 battlefields. The Union army broke and retreated back to Washington, getting entangled in the carriages heading back as well. A regular Army Reserve unit of 2,000 is all that stood in the way between the Confederate Army and Washington, D.C. When Jefferson Davis arrived, he urged his generals forward. Jackson said if he had 10,000 fresh troops, he would take Washington, but there were none. Lessons learned from Bull Run. Casualties. For the Union, there was 2,708 casualties. Of those 2,708, 481 were dead, 1,011 wounded, 1,216 missing, most of them captured. Confederate casualties consisted of 1,982, 387 dead, 1,582 wounded, and only 13 missing. At the Battle of Bull Run, the Federal forces were defeated, but the exhausted Confederates did not give chase. This battle gave the lie to the conventional wisdom that the time that the war would be over, one decisive victory for either side, and it would just only be a 90-day war. Union strategy before Bull Run. Secretary of State Seward suggested the war should be over in 90 days, but Scott warned that it would take at least 300,000 men, one good general, and up to 3 years to conquer the South. Scott's plan, that was dubbed the Anaconda Plan by the press, called for a 3-pronged attack that was designed to steadily squeeze the life out of the South. First, blockade the southern ports along its 3,550-mile line of coastline while organizing a Union invasion. About 800 vessels managed to evade the blockade in the first year. 6,000 ships had entered and cleared southern ports in 1860. The chances of capture were 1 in 10 in 1861. This would be reduced to 1 to 3 in 1864. Second, protect the United States capital, Washington, D.C., while Union forces advanced on all fronts. Third, slowly divide the South into parts, sending troops down the Mississippi to divide the Western Confederacy from the East. Lincoln rejected the plan since enlistment was only for 90 days. What he hoped for is that the war would be over before Congress was back in session and then he could reconstruct the states. After the Bull Run, he will end up adopting the plan. Southern strategy. The South hoped to win enough defensive battles to secure recognition from a foreign government and to convince enough Northerners that the war was not worth fighting. This, the Southern strategists reasoned, would then make it more likely for the United States to grant the Confederacy independence. Foreign recognition was vital to Confederate interests if the Confederates hoped to survive. Much like the rebellious colonies had courted France a century before, the rebels hoped to secure French recognition. Interesting to note is that the French agreed, but only as long as Great Britain would follow suit. But under pressure from the United States, Great Britain was split into two camps. There was pro-Union, led by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Lord John Russell, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Lord Richard Lyons, the Minister to the United States. On the pro-Confederate side was Henry Palmerston, the Prime Minister, and William Gladstone, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The English dependence myth of King Cotton, and Southerners thought cotton was the world's staple. Cut off cotton, the world will collapse. This belief leads to the diplomacy of coercion instead of persuasion. And in 1861, the Confederacy orders an embargo on cotton shipments to Great Britain and even orders the bales to be burned. Britain already had a large surplus of cotton, unbeknownst to the Southerners from previous years. Southern emissaries would then be unofficially sent, not to spark the wrath of the U.S. Secretary of State. These new emissaries, James Mason to England and John Slidell to France, boarded the British mail packet, the HMS Trent, from Havana on November 6, 1861. The Trent is going to be stopped by the USS San Jacinto, commanded by Captain Charles Wilkes, who arrested Mason and Slidell and took them back to Boston and put them behind bars for trial. Prime Minister Palmerston was outraged and ordered 6,000 British regulars to Canada. One war at a time, Lincoln said to Seward, and ordered the release of the Confederates. Mason and Slidell arrived in January of 1862 and were cordially received in Europe. The issuing on September 22nd of the Emancipation Proclamation would take effect on January 1st, 1863. All those enslaved in the Confederate territory to be forever free, and ordered the Army and all segments of the executive branch to treat as free all those enslaved in 10 states that were still in rebellion. In the fall elections, Democrats would gain control of 32 seats in the House of Representatives, governorships in New York and New Jersey, control of state houses in Indiana and Illinois. In his December address, Lincoln recommends to Congress to provide a constitutional amendment to provide for compensation and gradual emancipation in all states. Remember, there are 4 slave states that were still fighting for the Union, where slavery existed. Voluntary colonization of freedmen outside the United States. The immediate effects is that it diffused a radical criticism and unity in his administration. It alienated many Northerners who were Democrats and added a moral dimension to the Union war aim. It also would liberate millions of slaves as Union armies began to conquer the South. Although Lincoln had promised in his inaugural address to protect slavery wherever it existed, once slave lands were taken by federal soldiers, the chief issue became what to do with the slaves that had been captured. With one bold movement, Lincoln was able to turn the war into a war of liberation for the slaves, so that foreign recognition would not be denied, and that the Confederacy, who were looking to try to get recognition from France and England, will not be able to get it because they abolished slavery some years prior. And it encouraged those enslaved in the Confederacy to be less willing to help their masters. Vicksburg was now surrounded. After 6 weeks' bombardment, General John C. Pemberton will surrender 30,000 plus troops on July 4, 1863. After the news of the fall of Vicksburg, Confederate forces at Port Hudson, Louisiana surrendered on July the 9th, leaving the Mississippi River entirely in the Union control and splitting the Confederacy in half. The casualties between October and July were 9,000 Union and 10,000 Confederate, not counting prisoners. The effects. The North suffered 23,049 casualties, the Confederates 28,063 casualties. That's not the number dead. That includes dead, wounded, and missing. Lee began to withdraw into Virginia on July 4th. Rains prevented a rapid withdrawal and for 2 days at the Potomac River. but Meade failed to pursue Lee, giving Lee time to return to Southern soil. The Gettysburg Address. In November of 1863, Lincoln would give a speech that didn't last more than 2 minutes for the dedication of the National Cemetery. The speech did help Americans realize that the United States is a single nation, not a collection of states. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and the dedication of the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met here on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note or long remember what we say here, but can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have, thus far, so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that this government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Sherman's March to the Sea. Leaving Thomas to hold Hood and protect Tennessee, Sherman with 60,000 men will march to the Atlantic Ocean. Before leaving Atlanta, he confiscated or destroyed all useful equipment. Sherman cut a swath through Georgia 60 miles wide and 300 miles long. Sherman said he was going to make Georgia howl, and systematically destroyed factories, cotton gins, warehouses, bridges, railroads, and some public buildings. The same scorched earth policy used by Sheridan in Tennessee. His soldiers foraged liberally throughout the country, resulting in wild looting. Sherman's advance was virtually unopposed, advancing Savannah on the 10th of December, which fell on December 22nd. Savannah was not put to the torch, since his mayor rode out to meet Sherman to tell him the Confederate army had left. Having good memories of being stationed in Savannah as a lieutenant, Sherman would not have the city destroyed. Sherman would then wire Lincoln and says, "I present to you as a Christmas present the city of Savannah." Surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, 9 April 1865. With Grant in pursuit of Lee, Sheridan prevented Lee from moving by rail towards Johnston, virtually surrounding the Confederates. Lee's forces were now less than 30,000, had very few rations. Grant's aide said, "If the thing is pressed, the thing will surrender." On April 7th, Grant requested Lee to surrender, and Lee asked for terms. Grant, who had a terrific headache, said that it immediately went away. Lee would meet Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in the home of Wilmer McLean. McLean had previously lived at Manassas, where his house was the headquarters for Beauregard in the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861. After the battle, McLean wanted to move his family as far away from war as possible and moved to Appomattox Courthouse. McLean could rightfully say, "The war began in my backyard and ended in my front parlor." Lee had arrived first and waited for 30 minutes before Grant arrived. Grant arrived, apologized for being late, and tried to make small talk, saying he remembered Lee from the Mexican War, but Lee did not remember Grant when he was a lieutenant. Then Lee reminded General Grant the purpose of their meeting. They would quickly come to terms. Lee's soldiers were paroled and were allowed to return home. Their officers were permitted to retain their sidearms. All soldiers could retain their private horses and mules because it was planting season. All equipment was to be surrendered. 25,000 rations were going to be issued by the Union Army to the Confederates. When Lee stepped out, there was a big hurrah by the Union soldiers, but Grant hushed them and told them the Southerners are our countrymen again. A transformational war. Not only did the Civil War result in the preservation of the Union, the federal government's power and the seas expanded during the war. The Civil War was the first modern war in many ways, from the introduction of armored ships to that of rifled cannon. The war set the stage for future world wars. Signs and scholars point to indicating that this was a modern war included the use of railroads and steamboats for faster transportation, even the use of the telegraph. The scale and scope of the war, geographically, and the size of the militaries, and the types of military technological advancements that were made available. The 13th Amendment would make slavery illegal in the United States when it was ratified on December 18, 1865. The word slavery appeared for the first time in the Constitution. The debate today still continues why the North won the war. Some historians have focused on the weakness of the Confederacy, the lack of industry and railroads, and the tension between the states and the central government, killed by states' rights. Richmond had a poor political leadership under Davis, faulty coordination and communication. Robert E. Lee probably gives the best explanation when he said, after 4 years of tourist service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia had been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. General George Pickett, his famous charge at Gettysburg, would say, I always thought the Yankees had something to do with it. Historian Shelby Foote would claim that the North really fought this war with one arm tied behind its back, due to the amount of industry and the numbers that they used to fight the war. Later on, Sherman would actually accept the surrender of Johnston and give him even more terms. Jefferson Davis would be captured somewhere in Georgia, and the war was over.